It's easy to make lazy sense of any era. This was the time of the Abbey, or now is when the gate grew in prominence. Here we chart the path of this kind of movement in the theatre. It's very easy to do that. It sounds pretty good. It makes for a better story, gives you a nice convenient narrative, and to be honest, it probably sells more books of theatrical history than I ever will even try. It is slightly disingenuous. And it's certainly reductive. And I say that knowing that's kind of what I've done for the last couple of weeks. To try to tell a story, taking one point or another in order to expand upon it. It makes sense. It's a good narrative technique. It's not truthful. It gives you a sense of a truth, but it's not truthful. Irish theatre, it's kind of scattershot at the best of times. You look at it any time in history and you see the current movement and you see the future movement and you see things long left behind by everybody else, and they all kind of coexist simultaneously. But between the 1950s and the end of the 1970s, there's no single big movement or big name or big theatre to make the argument for building that history there. So I have my own thesis and I'll get to it at the end. But for this period of time, I want to paint a small picture of an Ireland that's living in this time. It's a very, very shortcut look at the history of the country. I'm skipping over so much of it to get to hit some of what I feel are the main themes. Is there a unifying theme? Well, see if you think you can find one from what I suggest. And I'm going to have a sort of take apart a few different stories from the time. Ireland had a tumultuous 20th century between rebellion, then independence, then a civil war, and that's just up to 1923. By the 1930s, we'd finally start to get down to the business of actually building a nation, stepping away, although not completely by any means, from that civil war stance. That politics has continued on until literally this week that I'm recording this, but it was no longer interfering with the development of a nation. These 1930s, when we got down to the business of building a nation, rural electrification, developing a sense of what Ireland is, creating an Ireland as distinct from the free state that was gifted by the British Empire. Well, that happened in tandem with an economic war with Britain, where if Britain was standing in splendid isolation, well, Ireland didn't even need their help. It wasn't easy, but we were building. Ireland was becoming a place. World War II happened. That meant rationing in Britain and the mass consumption of able-bodied men for the front. That was great for Ireland. We didn't get involved because we still had big hang-ups about our relationship with Britain, and to join on one side or the other would mean to essentially tacitly stir half the country to enmity with the other side. Ireland was also able to go en masse to Britain to work during World War II, or as we call it, the emergency. And we were able to export agricultural produce in mass quantities. Before World War II started, Ireland was still 65 to 70% agricultural. It could not have been more timely for us. A young nation starting out, just having gone through an economic war and several other wars in a short space of time. But the 6 years of death and destruction came to an end. And with that, even though it was another nearly 10 years before demobilization of the British Army was complete and conscription ended, and the end of rationing and all that didn't come quickly. It was 1954 before it was over. Several Irish who went during the war to work there or to join in the war effort never returned. Many did. And particularly with the return of British serving men between 1946 really and 1954, and the arrival of Caribbean arrivals on the in the Windrush episode, as the British call it, when two ships arrived from the Caribbean, bringing many people from there. The Irish were joined as were displaced as the lowest paid workers, and also joined as the least welcome. So it wasn't as appealing to stay. Many came back. Now, 1954, when on the 4th of July rationing was ended, that was a Marian year. So even though our nice cushy number of supplying tons of food to Britain, which was helping Ireland's industry greatly, had come to an end, even though many Irish were coming back, creating a jobs issue, um, there was a buoyancy. It was a Marian year. People were coming home who we hadn't seen for a while. So while that buoyancy kept Ireland upbeat for a while, it couldn't last. It is estimated by some that Ireland's worst year was probably 1956 or 1955, when the Marian year was over, rationing was over, so the handy money from exports was gone. The handy jobs in Britain were dying up. So many people came back, coinciding with a mass exodus from the land. This led to a larger urban population in a nation that did not have an industrial infrastructure. Money was a big issue. At a certain point, there were so many people here that, of course, emigration started again. And oftentimes, as well as to Britain, it went further afield to the United States, to Australia. Some went expecting to be back. Many never returned. Traveling to Australia or to the United States back then was not something you did casually. It's something that took time to get there and back because it was by boat. So once you got there, you seldom were coming back. Even though we were a very proud Catholic nation with ties all over the world with many different Catholic nations and missions going from our country to other places, we stayed out of the Great World Pacts. We couldn't join NATO because Britain was in it. And the Comintern, we didn't need to be the only communist nation, especially when we didn't have a communist government in essentially the Western Hemisphere. So NATO being the first world and their allies, Comintern being the second world and their allies, it left Ireland literally and figuratively as a third world country. A third world country in the sense that we're not in the first two worlds, but a third world country in the sense that we were a developing nation, as we like to call them now. It was a poor and dark place. There were no real exports beyond Britain, and that had gone down dramatically. An oppressive clergy and a government trying to establish its own power with its own repressions led to Ireland being benighted. Many in the nation started relying on remittances from the US and Australian-based family members. It's at this time that, let's say, there's the development of a new paradigm in the Irish imagination and the Irish reality. The successful Irishman was the one who was successful abroad. This, for me, colours an awful lot of the way we see Ireland and Ireland sees itself for the next 50 years. So what about the theatre? Well, let's look at it from three different angles: writers, actors, and theatres. So we'll start with writers because that's what we're known for. And the dominant figure between, we'll say, 1950 and 1980 has to be Samuel Beckett. He won the Nobel Prize in 1969 and is by a long way our most revered writer of the second half of the 20th century. His works have been performed the world over. His book, his great plays, particularly his first one, En attendant Godot, have been translated into many different languages from the original French. Because Samuel Beckett wrote En attendant Godot, or Waiting for Godot, as you probably know it, in French. It was he who translated it into German and into English when it turned out to be such a popular success. It was he who had to edit elements of it when the British Lord Chamberlain decided that certain passages and words were not acceptable in an English stage because it referred to the Bible. Ooh. We forget Britain had a strong censorship regime going up until the 1970s. Ireland, we'll get to. His first big one was En attendant Godot, 1953. It was written between 1948 and 49. He was just living after the war. He had been a writer before and a French and an English teacher and a French teacher. He moved back he had been visiting family in Ireland when the war broke out, and he raced back to defend his homeland, France. He didn't really come back to Ireland an awful lot once his mother had died. But I'm going to talk about him later in an episode practically dedicated to him. As a novelist, he wrote 2 plays in the late 40s and early 50s, Eleutheria and En attendant Godot, both in French. He got his partner, who was later to be his wife, Suzanne Deschavaux-Duménil, who was probably, to be honest, a large part of why he was successful. She was his agent. She was the one who worked at it for 3 years till she found a director in Roger Blin and got him to produce it. His play, he had to pick from them. He picked Godot, and that's basically the route he followed. Eleutheria was a sitcom kind of thing, except a little bit too intellectual to work as a sitcom kind of thing. So he probably made the best choice, which was so out there that it frustrated and delighted people, sometimes simultaneously. Fin de Partie was next, which we know as Endgame, and Krapp's Last Tape was his first play written in English. He was to write in multiple different languages, English, French, and German, repeatedly for the rest of his career. But between, we'll say, 1955, 54, when he started becoming popularly produced in Britain and Ireland and the United States, and 1970, when he started moving into even more experimental work, he was ubiquitous. By the time of his death in 1989, he was probably the most successful, most famous, and most popular Irish writer throughout the world, though not necessarily the most popular in Ireland. Brendan Behan's another big name who kind of shows up around here as well. And again, unlike Beckett, he's more revered in memory than he is on the page. Born in 1923, died in 1964. He started up with he was born in Dublin's inner city. He started up with the IRA and set off on an unauthorized solo bombing mission of Britain, which of course failed. Spent 3 years in prison, came back and got convicted for another crime, this time the attempted murder of Gardaí. He ended up in Mountjoy Prison, which is Dublin's most famous prison and Ireland's most famous prison. There it was that he learned Irish, and he also started to write plays. He wrote a play called The Landlady in there. After he left, he ran around in the poetry circuit and was quite successful as a poet in the Irish poetry scene, which was tough at the time. Patrick Kavanagh bestrode it, and there were a number of fairly, I suppose what you'd call now second tier, which is pretty big, poets knocking around the country at the time. Yeats had gone, and into the vacuum came people like Paddy Kavanagh and many others. He really hit his stride with his first play written on the outside, called The Quare Fellow, or The Quare Fellow, as in the gentleman who was unusual, queer in the sense as was back then. Set in prison about a guy who we never see, the Quare Fellow, who is going to be executed in the morning. It was first produced in a theatre called the Pike Theatre in 1954. It ran for 6 months, which is pretty unusual at the time for a small theatre that is, let's say, at best semi-professional. It was taken up by the famous Joan Littlewood and her theatre workshop in Britain, and then and quickly after arriving there, transferred to the West End. His next play up was Anguille, which translates from the Irish which it was written in, into The Hostage. It was produced in 1957 at the Damer Theatre, and then again transferred over to Britain to Joan Littlewood's theatre workshop. It's argued that it was made more bawdy and less serious, and there was the introduction of a lot more flamboyance and gay characters on Joan Littlewood's heavy influence. Theirs was a difficult working relationship, and so it's hard to know where one begins and where one ends, but they didn't get on well towards the end. She would still come to visit him in Dublin, though. Unfortunately, by this point, the popularity of 2 successive West End hits led to his going on TV. His appearances on TV were what made him successful in Britain, because he would show up drunk. They would give plenty of the old thing, and they still do this, of feeding alcohol to people who are going to be appearing on TV. Well, he overindulged. And so his appearances on TV proved a humiliation to many in Ireland, but was endearing for him, for many people to see him. This alcoholism led to ultimately his death from diabetes in 1964, and his decline as a writer. He had a number of other plays, but most of them didn't go anywhere, and they didn't get produced until after his death. It's a shame. Brian Friel, a major figure in the latter part of the 20th century, probably our second biggest writer of plays outside of Beckett, came to prominence with his first play in 1960. I'm going to talk about Friel at length on a different pod, so I'm not going to go on about it. The Francophile was produced in 1960. The Enemy Within wasn't a big hit, but it was in the Abbey in 1962. And then The Blind Mice at the Eblana Theatre with Gemini Productions in 1963. In 1964, The Gate took his latest play, based on a trip to visit Tyrone Guthrie in the United States. Was called Philadelphia, Here I Come. Produced by the Gate in 1964, it then went to it was in the Gaiety Theatre, which is one of our bigger stages, and then went on tour to the United States in 66. It was a huge success. This was the making of Brian Friel, and I won't say he lived off it. His plays get exceedingly sophisticated and interesting after this first one with its great coup de théâtre. But he was very popular in the Abbey in the 1970s, but wasn't getting anywhere. Faith Healer was released produced in 79 in London, and then came to the Abbey in 1980, where it was a huge hit, and then went off to tour around the United States. Translations, showing maybe a sign of his dissatisfaction with the Abbey, was produced by his own new theatre company called Fields Day, which was engaging with the situation in the North. It was produced in 1980, and another huge, huge hit that toured all over. It's interesting that the Abbey really, it gave him a shot but didn't care, but it was his success in 66 in the United States that built his name there. There were plenty of other playwrights at the time, Tom Murphy and Tom Kilroy being two of them, operating in the 60s, mostly in 70s. That's where they started out. Hugh Leonard, similarly so, his play Da, you may well know over here. Lee Dunn was a popular playwright and a populistish playwright, a Dublin-y kind of guy writing about what life was like in Dublin. Nothing particularly earth-shattering about Lee Dunn, or to be honest, Hugh Leonard either. Kilroy and Murphy did some really interesting things and are highly regarded. Lee Dunn, you can't get in print anymore. Hugh Leonard's plays also out of print. I think that's a bit unfair. I think Hugh Leonard has some really great work, like Da, like The Poker Session, and a number of other plays. Interesting, of the ones that I'm mentioning now, I do want to point out particularly John B. Keane, because he's a great example of what's to become of the Abbey. He had a play called Scythe, which was a really cutting, searing, edgy look into Irish rural life. Written it in 1959, offered to the Abbey, they rejected it. We will come back to it. It goes into the amateur drama circuit with the Listowel, his own local Listowel theatre company. It wins the Amateur All-Ireland, and as a result, the prize for winning the Amateur All-Ireland in theatre is you get produced for a week-long stint in the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. He never got accepted by the Abbey, though. Looking at some of the actors, to bookend the period, we've got Barry Fitzgerald, who was born in the 1880s, 1888, and he lived till 1930. Till 1961. He was an Abbey actor in the Abbey Theatre until 1936, when they went to the States to do a film version of The Plough and the Stars. He stayed in Broadway and in Hollywood, and won an Oscar in 1944 for a movie called Going My Way, and became our kind of big name actor because he was the Irish guy in all the American movies set in Ireland. He was in The Quiet Man. He was in, I think, Darby O'Gill. Eventually he came back to Ireland in 1959, sadly died in 1961. But he was our big name actor at the time. The other big name in and around the same time, the woman who followed on sort of shortly after him, was a woman called Siobhan McKenna, who had been born in Belfast but grew up in Galway. She started doing her theatre in the Tyviarch in Galway. Now, the Tyviarch's a really important theatre. It's our first Irish language theatre, our first major theatre outside of Dublin, I would argue. And it's a theatre that basically was helped be founded by Micheál MacLiamore, him of the Gate. She started acting there in Irish. She had her London debut in 1947 in I can't remember now, is it the Caucasian Chalk Circle? I think it's the Caucasian Chalk Circle by Bertolt Brecht. Success there led to her eventually moving on to Broadway and Stratford, Ontario in the 1950s, where, again, she's established as one of Ireland's leading actresses. She came back, she did a number of movies there, eventually came back, and the latter part of her career is working with companies like Druid, producing, again, the work of Tom Murphy. Her last play was with the Druid Theatre in a Tom Murphy play called Bonlia Gongoira. Again, successful from being abroad. There's others like Michael Gambon and Peter O'Toole and Pierce Brosnan, who were born, or in the case of Peter O'Toole, maybe born in Ireland, but spent most of their youth in Britain. Although Gambon moved to Dublin to work in the Gates to start his acting career, I generally would consider them, in some ways, actors who didn't start in Ireland so much as are Irish, if that makes a degree of sense at all. Let's get to the theatres and round this up, because we're hitting close to the 20, and I want to try and keep these things short. In terms of theatres, well, the Abbey had Ernest Bligh in charge until the 1960s. I think it was 1967. They had a big fire in 1951. Great start to the period I'm talking about. And they performed at the Queen's Theatre, which is now gone. Now, the Queen's Theatre was a popular place. It wasn't what you'd call a theatre that was cutting edge. They'd have touring shows that would be cutting edge. They'd have variety shows. They'd have a bit of everything. Once they got to the Queen's, they would take chances occasionally on new writers like Brian Friel. They'd give them a shot, but if it didn't take off, it was gone. Blythe was really big about producing popular, well-loved shows. There was a lot of revisiting of plays. There were a lot of comedies. There was a lot of stuff that really hadn't moved forward since when Shields was very popular at the time. Writers who had a great reputation, like Paul Vincent Carroll, disappeared, and he's still disappeared in Ireland, basically. The Abbey became stagnant. Largely, it was about raising money to rebuild the theatre, so I can understand that to a degree, but it's not an interesting time to look at the theatre. In the 70s, they start taking chances. They've got the main theatre going, and they've also got the Peacock going. Losing the Peacock during the Queen's years was a problem, because what it meant was there was no place to take risks. The Gate stuck to its fairly reliable fare of well-received and international hits from abroad, the bigger names from Ireland, a lot more Oscar Wilde, a little bit of George Bernard Shaw, bits and pieces. They weren't taking risks, but these were two men who set up a theatre to not be the risk-taking theatre. It was a theatre to be the theatre of the stuff that the Abbey doesn't do. At the time, during the 60s, because of how well known the homosexual relationship between Hilton Edwards and Micheál MacLeamore was, and because the Abbey was known for doing basically peasant comedies, the two theatres were known as Sodom and Begorra. That's the most interesting thing about those theatres at the time. They do take risks. Like I said, the Gate previewed Philadelphia, Here I Come. But the theatres themselves are not doing anything really different to what they had been doing. What is important is the growth of the amateur theatre circuit throughout Ireland. It was in this period between 50 and 80 that we see the rise of the 3-act festivals and the 1-act festivals. The 1-act festivals was I believe it happened in the fall or the autumn of the year, in the winter, where throughout the country, different small theatres would host their own 1-act theatre festival, where different theatre companies from the different locales around the country, from all over the country, and would travel the country, would go and spend 3 or 4 days of a weekend performing a play once in one theatre, maybe go on to another one and on to another one before going back home to work on a Monday morning. This was an amateur theatre festival. And annually, the 1-act festival would be held, the finals, depending on who'd won the most different performances, different festivals throughout the country, the finals would be held in a different place every year. The 3-act festival was, again, a 7 or 8 day festival where every night was a different play It could come from anywhere. Normally, it would be relatively regional. If you're in Kerry, you're getting them from Cork or Clare or Limerick or maybe Tipperary, maybe Waterford. It'd be unusual though. But generally, normally plays from within 100 miles or less would be performed by local companies with a view to the most successful ones going on to Athlone, where they would face each other, giving us finally the All-Ireland champions of drama. Now, the winner of the All-Ireland Theatre Festival, again an 8-day festival, All-Ireland 3-Act Theatre Festival, was to perform on the Abbey stage for a week. Hence John B. Keane's success. Beyond these, there's 3 other theatres I want to talk about very briefly. I'll start with the Eblana. Now, the Eblana was a mad theatre. It ran between 1959 and 1995. It was run by Phyllis of Gemini Productions, who went up to the people who run Busaurus, the headquarters of our bus system in Dublin. And she knew that there was a cine-reel theatre underneath the bus station, which, if you're waiting for your bus, and you could be waiting a while, you'd sit down, you'd watch newsreels. She took it over and turned it into a theatre. And this led to a lot of mockery. But this was a theatre that did amazing things. It opened for the first time in 1959 at the Dublin Theatre Festival and had plays by John B. Keane, Brian Friel, Tom Murphy. They got their some of their first plays produced there. The problem with it was, at certain points, normally every 15 minutes, you would hear a bus arriving or departing from overhead. It was also really, really, really close to the ladies' toilets and had the moniker of the only public toilet in Dublin with its own theatre. It was a shame that it closed down, but according to some rumours, it's still practically intact. It's never been converted. There was the Focus Theatre on the south side of Dublin, set up by Deirdre O'Connell. Deirdre O'Connell's an interesting one because she was born in the United States, trained under under Lee Strasberg there in the Stanislavskian and Method methods. That's an odd way to say it. In the system of Stanislavski and the Method School of Acting. She came over to Ireland in about 1964, maybe at the Focus Theatre, with different people's help, as an exclusively Stanislavskian theatre. It was a remarkable tiny little theatre, basically a garage at the back of somebody's backyard, just off the canal. And it did amazing work. I saw Charles Marowitz's work there for the first time. They used to do Chekhov. They used to do all the greats. So while we have Sodom and Begorra going on, we had a lot more risky and exciting theatre going on there, and in the Eblana as well. Sadly, the Focus Theatre closed in 2012. Deirdre O'Connell died in 2001. And while it had about just under, I think it was 45 years of a life, maybe 45 years of a life, the Focus Theatre produced some of our best actors who were to go on and leave Ireland in the 80s. People like Gabriel Byrne, you might have heard of. Finally, the Pike Theatre. Short little life, 8 years, 1953 to 1961. Alan Simpson and Carolyn Swift, who were a couple at the time, both brilliantly gifted writers, actors, directors, and theatre people. They had this small little theatre running for a while. It was the first theatre in Ireland that had Beckett's Waiting for Godot. It was the theatre where The Quare Fellow by Brendan Behan was debuted. It, again, small, did great work. What killed it was what was to be its biggest success. The Rose Tattoo by American writer Tennessee Williams was meant to be opening the 1957 inaugural Dublin Theatre Festival, the first of them. The festival goes to this day. Now, this is where it gets difficult. The show was closed, and it was often felt that this was an injustice that undone an Irish theatre. The injustice is greater. This is a picture of Ireland in a certain time. Ireland at that time was heavily influenced by a regressive wing of the Catholic Church, the Knights of Columbanus, sorry. And it was felt that the government was doing its job, doing the job of the church by closing the show down. It was said to be somewhat lewd and I think obscene was what it was said to be. I don't know the play very well myself. It's years since I read it. But it's a hugely important one, not for Irish theatre, but for Ireland. The government at this stage was trying to define itself as not being the Irish Church in the Dáil, in our parliament. They were trying to do their own thing. So when this came to be a case, there were some members of the government who were in the Knights of Columbanus, and they were very, let's say, hot on the idea of interfering with this. The government knew this, and they said, before we are called upon to do this, we need to kill this show on our own basis. If we let this show go on, and then the church speaks up, we will be seen only as an organization of the church. We need to establish ourselves separately. So the government closed it down. They sent in the guards, people were arrested, and years later, I think Alan Simpson was proven to have been innocent, that this was a wrong use of government resources to shut down a show, and that the government didn't have the right to do it. This didn't help the Pike. The reputation it got because of it, and simply the difficulties of living with that, led to its shutting down in 1961. Sadly, Simpson and Swift divorced. They both went on to be very successful in different ways. And Simpson went on to work in the Abbey Theatre. Swift went on to work with RTE, Radio Telefís Éireann. But this was a moment in Ireland's history that is extremely significant. Something successful, and that would have been a huge success, which came from abroad, shutting down. And that's sort of, for me, the two sides of Irish theatre. The need for something to be recognised elsewhere, for it to be successful here, or for it to be accepted as successful, be it as a writer, as a director, or simply just a play. And the assertion of an Irish theatre and an Irish government and an Irish state as separate to the church's influence. It's still a work in progress to this day in different ways. I think Ireland is a much more secular state now than it ever has been, and to be honest, in many ways more secular than the United States. But there's always elements.